Lecture 5, Gita to Gandhi, Yogas and Modern Hinduism.
It's one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Indian literature, told in one of India's two great epics, the Mahabharata. Two armies, consisting of two sets of cousins, face off over the battlefield, preparing to go to war. The conflict arises from a succession dispute between the Pandavas, the good guys, and the Kauravas, the bad guys. The great warrior prince Arjuna is ready to fight, but when he looks over at his cousins on the other side of the field, he hesitates. He doesn't know if he can fight his relatives, whom he's known for years and alongside of whom he's trained in his youth. He talks about his dilemma with his charioteer, Krishna, whose true identity will only be revealed later. Their long philosophical and theological conversation becomes one of the most important scriptures in the Hindu tradition, the Bhagavad Gita. While it's part of the larger Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, which means the Song of the Lord, is an important text in its own right, containing teachings on many of the most important Hindu concepts. The text has had a powerful impact on Indian thinkers and activists for centuries, and it was one of the books most valued by the great leader of the Indian independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "When doubts haunt me, when disappointments stare me in the face, and I see not one ray of hope on the horizon, I turn to the Bhagavad Gita and find a verse to comfort me." Over the last 2 centuries, many Western thinkers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Aldous Huxley have found inspiration in it. Well, as Arjuna hesitates to fight, Krishna tells Arjuna that he must act in accordance with his dharma, and only for the sake of dharma. The message to the reader: we shouldn't act to get something for ourselves. Krishna says, be intent on action, not on the fruits of action. Be impartial to failure and success. Attachment to results brings desire, suffering, frustration, and anger, so one should not act out of such attachments. Rather, the disciplined person acts with equanimity and commitment to duty. Krishna advises us on how to accomplish this. So rather than being attached to the fruits of the action, the person performs the action as a sacrifice, offering up the action to the Lord. In this way, the text brings together action and devotion. One's actions are dedicated to the Lord, in this case Krishna, and one comes to see everything one does in one's life as a form of devotional sacrifice. The climactic moment of the Gita occurs in a chapter entitled The Vision of Krishna's Totality. In this chapter, Arjuna is given the opportunity to see Krishna in his entirety rather than through a single form. Although he cannot do this with his own eyes, our human eyes are too limited, he's given the divine eye, which makes it possible for a human being to see God directly. And Krishna says, Arjuna, see my forms in hundreds and thousands, diverse, divine, of many colors and shapes. See, all the universe stands here as one in my body. And at this point, Arjuna is too awestruck to speak. He's rendered speechless by the sight of Krishna's boundless divinity. We're told that it was a multiform, wondrous vision. Arjuna saw all the universe in its many ways and parts standing as one in the body of the God of gods. The text proceeds to describe the innumerable manifestations of Krishna, which completely overwhelm Arjuna. And in the face of this endless multiplicity and magnificence, Arjuna pleads, "Show me, God, the form I know. I want to see you as before with your crown and mace and the discus in your hand." In other words, the experience of God's totality is not meant for beings such as us. We need to access the divine in a form we can handle with our senses and minds. Arjuna wants to return to the familiar form. However, he, and we, the readers, know that this form can never capture the wholeness of the divine. Rather, it serves as a focal point for our worship and a symbol that gestures beyond itself to the infinite. The Gita presents a range of paths to liberation. Yogas. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit word yuj, which is etymologically linked to our word yoke, as in to yoke a cart to an ox. It means to tie together, or as many people interpret it, to unite. And this is why many people define yoga as union. Seen this way, it can refer to the union of the human with the divine, or the union of the body and the soul. Another way to see it looks back to this word yoke, meaning to bind oneself to a path or a practice. In other words, yoga is a discipline leading to liberation. You probably will not be surprised to discover that the Gita, like the Hindu tradition as a whole, presents multiple paths to liberation. We've seen many forms of pluralism in Hinduism. The notion of multiple deities all being legitimate, multiple goals all being worth pursuing. Here we find that there are different paths that can lead a person to liberation, and people of different dispositions might find themselves drawn to different paths. While there are many forms of yoga, 4 are featured most prominently in the Gita. The first is karma yoga, the yoga of action. The second is bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. The third is jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. The words jnana and knowledge are related. And the fourth is raja yoga, or royal yoga, the yoga of meditation. It's worth noting that the physical practice of yoga that features poses and breath work is not a focus of the Gita. That discipline, hatha yoga, develops later, and we'll look at it after we examine the 4 forms of yoga emphasized in the Gita. The Gita focuses a great deal on karma yoga, the yoga of action. It rejects the idea of renunciation as giving up action, because that would undermine dharma and the social and cosmic orders. One acts, but renounces the results of action. Krishna states that actions should be done by, quote, relinquishing to me attachment to the fruit of action. This is my decisive idea, he says. Renunciation of action is inappropriate. So here we can see one of the central achievements of the Gita, reconciling the 2 great strains of Indian thought. Dharma, which requires involvement with the world, and renunciation, which some people took to mean leaving the world behind. The Gita incorporated the idea of renunciation directly into action, so that one could be a renouncer while acting in the world. Gandhi believed that the central teaching of the Gita is selfless action. In fact, Gandhi is an ideal example of a person living out the life of the yoga of action. He wrote, "I was not built for academic writings. Action is my domain. What I understand, according to my lights, to be my duty, I do. All my action is actuated by the spirit of service." To the Gita's great synthesis of action and renunciation is added yet another element, devotion. The renouncing of the fruits of action to the deity, performing the action as a sacrifice to God, brings action, renunciation, and devotion together. The elements of devotion to the gods, bhakti, becomes one of the primary features of Hindu religion. In the previous lecture, we discussed the ways that devotional worship, puja, is practiced, including offerings of food and light, chanting mantras in the divine name, bathing and clothing the deity, and so on. The path of devotion is discussed in some of the texts about the gods, the Puranas. One of them states, "The characteristic of pure devotion to the Supreme Being is that it has no motive and is incessant." It's worth reflecting on that statement. Think of how many people's devotion has an element of self-interested motive in it, getting some worldly or heavenly reward, for example. Think of how much devotion is done only on certain days or special occasions. What would it be like to have unceasing devotion, so that every act one does is oriented in some way toward God? Some of the highest written expressions of the path of bhakti can be found in the devotional poetry of medieval India. The height of the bhakti poetry movement in India can be found in the 12th to 18th centuries, when poets, including people in the lowest castes and women, wrote passionate poetry in regional languages which gave ordinary people access to the work. Some devotional poems use romantic imagery and metaphors of sexual union to talk about the connection of the devotee and the Lord. The next form is jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. It's important to point out that knowledge here does not refer to a collection of facts that one can memorize. It's not Jeopardy knowledge. Keep in mind that all yogas are paths to liberation. So the knowledge here is transformative knowledge, a knowing of the deepest liberating truths. The school of Indian philosophy that has had the greatest impact on modern Indian and Western thought is Vedanta, which bases its writings largely on the Upanishads, the final books of the Vedas, hence that name Vedanta, which means end of the Vedas. This system of philosophy examines the nature of the soul and ultimate reality. Schools of Vedanta may differ in their views of the relationship between the absolute, I'll use the term God here, and the individual soul. So one school, for example, is called Dvaita Vedanta, or dualistic Vedanta. In this school, the most prominent thinker of which is the 13th century philosopher Madhva, there's a distinction between God and the individual soul. This is similar to most Jewish, Christian, and Islamic understandings of the relationship between God and individual human beings. Another school which has been profoundly influential is Advaita Vedanta, or non-dualistic Vedanta. In this school, all of reality is one, and there's an identity between the individual soul, the Atman, and ultimate reality, Brahman. In the previous lecture, we saw the passage from the Upanishads, "That art thou," that plays a central role in Advaita Vedanta. The most famous proponent of this school is Adi Shankara, who lived in the 8th and 9th centuries. His biography is well known. There's even a feature film in Sanskrit about him. And there are many remarkable stories of his learning and wisdom. Shankara writes, "Since the root cause of transmigratory existence, rebirth, is ignorance, final liberation results from knowledge of Brahman. Only knowledge can destroy ignorance. Action cannot destroy it." Raja Yoga is the yoga of meditation, the contemplative path that leads the seeker through a series of practices that result in the direct experience of one's soul. The classic statement of this path is the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, composed around the 3rd century CE. The first statement of the Yoga Sutra contains the essence of this path. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. And this means yoga is the cessation of mental fluctuations or mental activity. It goes on to say, when mental fluctuations cease, the spirit stands in its true identity as observer to the world. Otherwise, the observer identifies with the turnings of mental activity. A very important theme seen in Indian religion is contained within this passage: the importance of stilling the mind through a contemplative practice. Many Indian traditions teach that we cannot see the most important truths regarding the nature of the world or ourselves unless we have a practice to quiet the unruly, noisy, ego-centered mind. If we can quiet the mind, we can come to see our true identity, in this case, the soul. Our true identity is not as a participant in the world, but rather as a witness, an unaffected observer. Patanjali set up a system known as Ashtanga Yoga, which means 8-limbed yoga. The 8 limbs of yoga practice are as follows. First, moral principles, meaning nonviolence, truthfulness, non-stealing, celibacy, and the absence of greed. Second, observances. These include bodily purification, and there are many forms of this, including the cleansing of the nose using a neti pot, purification of the digestive tract, and so on. The third, posture. Fourth, breath control. Fifth, withdrawal of the senses. That's part of that separation from the world. The sixth is concentration. Seventh is meditation. And finally, the 8th, samadhi, or pure contemplation, absorption. This is the state of resting completely in the spirit with the total quieting of mental fluctuations. All this time I've been talking about yoga, and you might be wondering when I'm going to talk about people stretching and twisting into pretzels and standing on their heads. This is what is known to most people in the West as yoga, but this is a later development as a separate school. In the 8-limbed system of Patanjali, the third limb, you might recall, was posture. But the Yoga Sutra says almost nothing about posture. All it says is that the posture of yoga should be steady and easy, and that, quote, it is realized by relaxing one's effort and resting like the cosmic serpent on the waters of infinity. Easier said than done. The text doesn't give any specific guidance on what postures to take. So the notion here is that the body must be in a stable, relaxed state in order to practice the limbs of breath control and meditation. The posture that becomes most closely associated with meditation is the lotus posture, in which one sits with an erect spine and each foot crossed over the opposite thigh in a completely balanced state. Centuries later, a form of yoga that focuses on postures and breath developed, which has led to the form of yoga we know today as Hatha yoga. The word Hatha means effort, so Hatha yoga is a form of yoga that requires the application of energy and will. The word can also be seen as combining the syllables Ha for sun with Tha for moon, which indicates that yoga is a practice that unites opposites. Although the system of Hatha yoga dates back far earlier, the most famous early text of the tradition is the 15th century text Hatha Yoga Pradipika. The text emphasizes that the poses, known as asanas, are not to be done for their own sake. Rather, they're to help one prepare to engage in Raja Yoga, the meditative path to liberation. The text states that Hatha Yoga, like a staircase, leads the aspirant to the high pinnacled Raja Yoga. It is solely for the attainment of Raja Yoga. In other words, we do poses so that we can hold a stable meditative posture. And any of you who've tried to sit in lotus posture with a straight spine for a long period of time know that a lot of flexibility and strength is necessary. The poses cultivate this. In addition, the poses also have many benefits for the body's muscles, the spine, the joints, and organs. The text recognizes this. It says, asana should be practiced for gaining steady posture, health, and lightness of the body. Over time, systems of Hatha yoga that focused on proper alignment of poses and sequences of poses developed. Different poses had different effects, calming or energizing the body, helping with digestion, or healing illness. Yoga practice provides the benefits of strength, flexibility, and balance. The practice of yoga is connected with a particular understanding of anatomy. In the Indian system of anatomy, we have not only a physical, material body that's sustained by and made up of food, but also a subtle body of energy flow in which our life force, or prana, flows along channels. These channels run throughout our body, and at certain places they intersect to create powerful centers called chakras, which means circles or wheels. There's a chakra at the base of the spine, the genitals, the solar plexus, the heart, the throat, and between the eyes. The chakra between the eyes corresponds with the third eye, a source of inner seeing, a higher consciousness or wisdom. The chakra is sometimes called a bindu, a point or dot, and the spiritual or ornamental cosmetic dot that's applied there with paste or a sticker is connected with that notion of the third eye. Finally, there's a chakra at the crown of the head that's the site of higher consciousness and the attainment of union, which can be seen as the connection of female energy, Shakti, with male energy, Shiva, and the union of the human and the divine. In some forms of yoga, there's a focus on the energy that rests coiled up at the base of the spine, which is seen as a goddess in serpent form, Kundalini. Through practice, this is known as Kundalini Yoga, one learns to cultivate this energy so that it moves up the chakras, awakening each one as it uncoils, so you feel the heat and energy traveling up the body. Those who commit themselves to the pursuit of liberation through all these kinds of yogas often seek out a guru, a spiritual teacher and guide. Deep devotion to a guru is a strong element in Hinduism, and disciples often express their devotion by touching the feet of the guru. Communities of disciples often practice together in an ashram, a compound of devotees under the leadership of a guru. While Hinduism is one of the world's oldest religious traditions, it's never been static. It's been undergoing continuous transformation from the time of its origins, and some dramatic changes have occurred over the last couple of centuries. Some of these changes were sparked by encounters with Enlightenment Western thought, and in the 19th and early 20th centuries, developments within Hinduism took the shape of what became known as the Hindu Renaissance. Members of the Reform movement emphasized reason and rejected elements of Hinduism they considered unethical, superstitious, or backward, such as icon worship, child marriage, caste and untouchability, and the practice of sati, or widow burning, against which many of them vigorously campaigned. Some of them drew on philosophical texts, such as the Upanishads, and their Hinduism tended to take the shape of an ethical monotheism or monism with an impersonal, formless deity. Some of the changes in modern Hinduism happened as a result of British control of India, which ended with Indian independence in 1947, which led to the partition of India and Pakistan. Many Indians who advocated for Indian independence, like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, wanted India to have a secular government that would not favor any religion over any other. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others would live peacefully together. But for some Indian nationalists, Hinduism was the primary source of pride and strength, and the resistance to the British drew on explicitly Hindu historical and religious themes. They emphasized the past glory of Hindu kings, they promoted Hindu solidarity, often bringing in an element of anti-Muslim sentiment. In other words, they believed that India should be for Hindus, and Muslims and others should either leave or accept second-class status. And it was a member of this group who assassinated Gandhi because he felt that Gandhi was too accommodating toward Muslims. This form of Hindu nationalism, some of which takes very strident militant forms, is still alive in India today. And some of its proponents have opened schools to pass this ideology on to the next generation of Hindu Indians. It's important to remember that throughout most of India today, in villages and cities throughout the country, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others live peacefully side by side. As I traveled through India, I saw members of every religious tradition living as neighbors, engaged in commerce, and playing cricket together. Cricket is practically a national religion in India. Young people played it everywhere, and there were often multiple channels on TV featuring cricket. I also saw members of one religious tradition going to the temples and sacred sites of the other traditions. Hindus, for example, will often go to Sufi shrines. Sufis are the mystics of Islam, as we'll see later, to receive blessings and pay homage. India is the world's largest democracy, and it features a religiously diverse population. But at the same time, religious tensions often simmer beneath the surface, as racial tensions do in the United States. And a conflict or violent event can bring these up to the surface, sometimes triggering widespread violence. In the last lecture, we discussed Hindu worship in the temple and the home. But what's it like in the West? What would you be likely to encounter if you went to a Hindu temple in the United States, or if you were invited into a Hindu family's home? Unlike the case of Buddhism, there's not a large community of converts to Hinduism in the West. So most Hindus are immigrants from India or other parts of South Asia, and their children. In India, Hindu influences can be seen and felt everywhere, from large spectacular temples to small roadside shrines, from cartoons about Hindu gods on television to lively festivals in the street. So Hindus growing up in India absorb a tremendous amount about Hinduism just from the environment around them. But this is not the case in the West. So here, Hindu parents must make a greater effort to teach their children the tradition and to maintain a connection with the community. Sunday schools and summer camps that teach Hinduism to children and foster a sense of Hindu community are increasingly common. For this reason, some scholars have reported that many Hindus find themselves more religious in the West than they were in India. Others, however, choose not to make the effort and find their ties to their tradition becoming looser. While Hindu temples are very important, much of Hindu worship is based in the home. The homes of most observant Hindus have shrines to the deity or deities they worship. Worship rituals, the pujas, are performed every day, often by the oldest woman in the house. These pujas involve chanting mantras, often involving the name of the deity, and offering flowers, food, incense, and light, arati, to the god. If Hindus live in areas that have a Hindu temple, as most major diverse cities do, many will attend weekly worship there. This is an interesting change from the tradition in India, because there's no weekly service at Hindu temples in India. Instead, people either go whenever they're moved to do so. It might be because of an important event in their lives, or they're just in that area, or they go on big festival days. In America, however, many Hindu temples have adopted the weekly ritual schedule, with many temples offering Sunday worship. On Sunday mornings, there will be a lecture or sermon, often centering on themes from important Hindu texts. And these are given by knowledgeable members of the community, not by the priests, whose duties primarily center on rituals. The liveliest area is this large room with all of the mini temples or shrines featuring the Hindu deities. Here, in a room filled with music and chanting, and with priests adorning the deities and making offerings while chanting, families will receive darshan, that visual connection. They'll offer prayers, they'll receive blessings. There are no seats or pews, and people can walk around to the different deities as they wish. The large Hindu temples in America feature virtually all the most prominent deities of the tradition, as they must serve Hindus who come from a range of backgrounds. The temple is not only a place for worship, but it's also a place for the community to come together. Every Sunday after the pujas are over, there's a traditional Indian vegetarian lunch prepared for everyone at the temple. Religious schools for children will often be located in the temple, along with rooms for cultural activities. Classes may also be offered for adults, and these often focus on practical courses that help with health or daily life. Examples include yoga, meditation, and stress management. At many temples, cultural events will be organized for holidays, and these might include music and dance performances, as well as plays based on the Hindu epics. Finally, we'll look at a religious movement that arose from Hindu foundations, but took on new forms in the West: the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, or, as it's more popularly known, the Hare Krishnas. This is a devotional movement that centers on Krishna primarily through the practice of chanting divine names. The origins of practices go back to the 16th century Bhakti movement led by Chaitanya, who taught that chanting the name of Krishna is the most powerful method for bringing about Krishna consciousness, a mind of pure devotion. The chant, which can be heard in Hindu temples throughout India, and now thanks to ISKCON throughout the world, is as follows: Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. If you attend a Hare Krishna worship service or see Hare Krishnas at a festival or parade, they'll most likely be joyfully dancing, playing instruments, and chanting these words. ISKCON was founded by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who, in 1965, at the age of 70, having never left India before, knowing virtually no one in the United States, sailed on a ship to this country, a harrowing journey during which he had a heart attack. He arrived with hardly anything other than some books and a typewriter, which was stolen in New York. And in New York, he began to chant in the park and teach others about Krishna. This was the 1960s and a time of openness to other traditions and consciousness exploration, so he attracted more and more followers, many of them young people. Among his most famous followers was the Beatle George Harrison, who remained a devotee throughout his entire life. If you listen to his song, My Sweet Lord, for instance, you'll hear the Hare Krishna chant in the background. After his death, Harrison's ashes were scattered in the Ganges. From its origins in the Indus River Valley civilization and the Vedic tradition to the new forms of Hinduism in the contemporary West, the stream of Hinduism has undergone continuous change. If you attend a yoga class or talk about your karma, Hinduism has already had an impact on you. Hinduism is now truly a world religion. And I hope that if you visit a Hindu temple or the home of a Hindu friend or neighbor, you'll be familiar with the major concepts, deities, and practices of the tradition. India was also the birthplace of one of the other great world religions, a tradition that began with one man's rejection and transformation of some of the elements of Indian religion that we've studied so far. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, but but he would become known as the Buddha. In our next lecture, we'll look at the way his teachings gave rise to the religion of Buddhism.